Hello, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Lana. I will run this. As usually, I'm running the Sitecore User Robotics meetups. So we're happy to see you again back to our meetup. And let me share some good news with you. So in October, we celebrated our first year anniversary. And during that year, we had 4 meetups with speakers from US, Slovakia, Belgium, Latvia. We have reached 117 members on our meetup group. And there was also a big event, a Sitecore Symposium in October, where 104 companies globally were recognized for their experience and use of Sitecore solutions. And by the way, our Kranti was among 10 subject master experts from Global Accenture and Avanade who participated in around 40 brain date sessions with customers. So that's really, October was full of big events for us, big news.
Yeah, and one was with Jason too.
Oh, even, yeah. So we have, you see which people we have today. So, and as usual, we keep updated our social media channels. So keep follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook, subscribe on YouTube and Meetup, and you will be updated on the latest events, industry trends, and see video recordings. So we have also updated edited our Meetup videos in YouTube, and we will plan some other adjustments there. So it will be more easy and comfortable for your search of the topics. And so Jeff or Jean-Francois Leroux, I hope I did it correctly. So is senior software developer at Sitecore hackathon winner in 2018 in the JSS category, and various years Sitecore technology MVP. So yeah, Jeff, you can continue also the presentation and you can take the stage.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Mhm.
Yes, I'm at Sitecore for 2.5 years now. Before worked at Coveo for multiple years and got to know Sitecore while working there. So, and I'm very much into front end more than back end. So, should I start right now or wait for bio break? Okay.
I think we can start. Yeah. Mhm.
So today I'll talk about the Sitecore JSS development workflow with Storybook that we came with in the Sitecore demo team in our current project. So this is the agenda. I'll talk a little bit about problems and limitations for the official disconnected mode of Sitecore JSS and the connected mode as well. I'll introduce Storybook and Chromatic, and I'll talk about the desired workflow that we came up with, and then detail all the integration that needs to happen to make that workflow a reality, and finish with some additional resources. So the disconnected mode of Sitecore JSS has a couple of problems and limitations for front-end developers and also back-end. But first and foremost, there are a couple of file types that are not supported when you create the fake data for your different fake pages or fake routes. So that could be problematic if you start having more complex data structures and more complex fake pages. Then you are not able to create the information as it would be stored in Sitecore, like list, field types, and multi-list and stuff like that. Not all of that is supported. Also, when you work in disconnected mode, you do import the fake items into Sitecore using a JSS CLI command. So you push your content through to Sitecore. But once it's pushed, you cannot really rename or move the imported items because the next push would recreate a couple of those items that you renamed or moved, and it becomes super messy. There's also a couple of issues with data source item duplication. Once you start having a couple of fake pages with fake components and you reuse those components across the different pages and you want to have the same look and feel. Let's say you have a navigation that accepts some data source to be displayed, but all of your page have that same navigation. And what happens when you import that into Sitecore? It creates one data source per page. It also, so I can share some screenshots here. Move that away. There. Okay. So this is an example of the source control of that project that we were working on. So in the rendering folder, which is the Next.js application, there was the data folder with all the fake data. And for example, the About Us page had a section with a call to action link. It had inside it a news component. And every page has a header component, which has a placeholder and another component inside it for the main navigation. So this main section and this other, let me clarify. So no, the section that we see on line 20 has a placeholder on line 29, which has a news grid. And same thing for the next one for the sponsors on line 32. It also has a placeholder and it also has another sub component. So those two sections for the sponsors and the news, we wanted them on all the pages. So for all of them, it was creating some page components under the pages. So this is a screenshot of the serialized items of my project. And we can see that the About Us page, the account page, the login page, each have the same section components that are for the news and the sponsors. So it created a ton of duplication that we had to clean afterwards when we switched to the Sitecore first mode and we removed the disconnected mode. So it was more task to do on our side just to fake the data and quickly create the pages where I think Storybook could help instead of using disconnected mode. Also, in disconnected mode, when you have the YML files describing your pages, if you insert a component between two existing components, and this component has a data source, then everything starts to be messy on the Sitecore side because as you can see, the components are created with their type names and -1, 2, 3 if there are many of that type. If I insert another section between section 1 and 2, then the data source starts to be reused. So data source number 2 now has the content of the new section I add between 1 and 2, and then it creates a section 4.yml file that contains the content of the current section 3.yml file. So your commit history starts to look messy because contents move from one data source item to another when you add extra components. Then if you work in connected mode instead, so Sitecore first mode, you have other problem and limitations for the front-end developers. Now they must have a Sitecore instance to develop and test their components. They need to define the data source templates in Sitecore with all the fields. They need to create data source items. They need to add the components to an existing page in Experience Editor or Horizon and attach the data sources to see the component in reality. And they are developing the HTML and the CSS. So it's not really their job to know how to create templates in Sitecore, how to create data source item, use the Experience Editor and Horizon. And it also forces the front-end developers, since they need to have that Sitecore instance, to use Windows machines with or without Docker, depending on the infrastructure of the project. So they cannot use their existing tools, and most front-end developers use Mac these days because it's a really good platform to develop. So both have problems and limitations, and I think Storybook could help a lot for that. So what is Storybook? Let me show you in Storybook is an NPM package. It's a tool that runs locally on your computer as a developer, and it has a UI that looks like this that we see on the screenshot. It's a library of all of your components and all of the variants of your components. And it's live. So as you are editing the source code of your components, it updates automatically given what you just changed. So it watches your source files. You can also not just do components visualization like this, but as you see in the animation, there are controls, actions you can do. You can test accessibility. You can have unit testing with Jest and other plugins. And you can even see fake pages. So you can build a story in Storybook that has multiple components and simulate what they would look like if they were all on a page side by side. It's agnostic to the framework you are using to develop your website, so it can work with React, Vue, Angular, and many other technologies we see on the right side. There are multiple plugins as well for Storybook. So some of them are here. For example, StoryShots is a plugin. It takes screenshots of each component and each variant of component that you have and stores them in your commit source control. And then you can run a test that takes new screenshots for a branch or pull request and compare them with the existing accepted screenshots that are in the source control. And then Lily will tell you which screenshot, which component has changed since the last accepted version. And then you can know if your commit or your change had side effects elsewhere that you didn't want. Chromatic is similar to that. It's kind of doing the same thing as I just described, but as a service in the cloud. And this is a paid service. There's also a free tier for smaller projects where you have a limited number of automated screenshots per month that you can have. And this is one of the tools I will talk as well today. There are many other plugins. I won't cover all of them. And as I said, Chromatic is that automated tool that creates, maintains the screenshots, and gives you a nice UI to visualize what has changed. It can also hook to your pull request in GitHub or other systems and block the pull request until all the components that have changed since the last accepted version are reviewed manually and approved and published and so on. I will show you how to do that by the end of the presentation, at the end of the integration, but this is what Chromatic is used for. Now, the desired workflow that we came up with in the demo team is something like that. We have our front-end developers. They run Storybook locally when they develop. They use the out-of-the-box JSS scaffold CLI comment to create their components. And it creates automatically a Storybook story for the new components they create. So they have everything they need to be able to visualize their new components right away in Storybook. So they use Storybook, they modify the story file, they add edge cases to their stories. They add variants to simulate those edge cases. And they develop their component, the content of the component, the look and feel in the CSS. And when they have a component that is respecting what was asked, they create a PR for their component. So they don't have to do anything in Sitecore. They create only front-end assets and they can see them. Now, how those components are used inside Sitecore, it's not their problem. Now there's a reviewer that reviewed their pull request. The reviewer used Chromatic and to see the visual changes for the PR. So maybe it's a new component that was created. They can see it, what it looks like, what are the edge cases that the front-end developer added. If it's a modification to existing CSS components or anything else in the front-end application, they can also use Chromatic to ensure that no other components other than the one that was modified were impacted by the changes of this pull request. So they approve the changes in Chromatic. It unlocks the pull request, and the pull request can go on. Then we have backend developers, Sitecore developers, that go in Sitecore and create the required data source template for the new components created by the front-end developers. Or they add fields to existing templates. They do their job so the new component can have the right fields as defined in the front-end component properties. Then they also create JSON rendering items if there are new components that could be used by page editors. They commit that, and that becomes developer-owned items, the templates and the renderings. And then the page editors in production, then they create the data source items for the components they want to add on the pages. They add components to the pages with Horizon or Experience Editor and bind their data sources and use the new components created by both front-end and back-end developers. And now the fun part, the technical one. How do we integrated Storybook in our project? So what I did for this user group, I created a sample React Next.js application that is from the template provided by Sitecore. And I've committed that in the JSS Next.js Storybook repository, which I can later on tell you what the address is for that. It's public. And I've started modifying this project. I removed disconnected mode. I then integrated Storybook, integrated Chromatic and everything. And I come to problems on the road and I documented those problems. This is what I will show you today. So if I go to this window and I'll zoom out a little bit. So this is the root of my repository. I've started with the template using this comment. So it was a .NET New Sitecore Next.js getting started. And the name of my project was JSS Next.js Storybook. And for the JSS part of the application, I wanted GraphQL fetching for the layout service instead of REST. And I wanted the pre-render to be static site generation instead of server-side rendering. So that's the command I used to create that. What it created is a complete project, including Docker, to run the Sitecore part of the project with a CM, a rendering host, and SQL and everything. And it also created a source folder with 3 different subfolders. First one is items. It's the serialized items that should be in the Sitecore database, master database. Second one is platform, which is Visual Studio .NET Framework project for my Next.js application or JSS application configurations, as well as any pipelines, processors, and other things I want to create. And the last one, and the one interesting in this case, is the rendering folder, which is the Next.js front-end project, which is the package.json here. One thing to note is if I edit those front-end files while I'm opened in the main folder in Visual Studio Code, this doesn't load Prettier, StyleLint, and other front-end tools and extensions that I have installed. So I won't see the nice CSS and nice React things. So I will switch to another Visual Studio Code that is opened on the rendering folder automatically only. So I don't see the rest of the Docker stuff. It's only the front-end project. Back to here, I'll show you what I did for this project. So first, I created the project. I committed everything in my repo. And then I committed the serialized items and I removed the disconnected mode. That was the first thing I did. So I removed all the Sitecore definitions for all the components. I removed all the fake roots, the fake media items, and the fake content, because all of this was already pushed to Sitecore and serialized as real items in the previous commit. So once I got rid of all of those things, then I could not use the disconnected mode anymore. That's where I added Storybook. So to add Storybook, it's very easy. You go at the root of the front-end project. In my case, it's the rendering folder. And you run npx sb init. So sb is an npm package for Storybook that has an init command. And npx is similar to npm, but it downloads and executes the npm package right away without storing it in your project or in your cache. So it downloaded the SB package and ran it with the init attribute. It spit a couple of things in the console and it auto-detected the type of front-end project I was using. It auto-detected that it was Next.js with React and created the right files at the right locations for me to be able to use Storybook. So then I committed again what it looked like. The main thing is the package.json changes. It added a script called Storybook that is doing start Storybook on the port 6006. It also created another script called build Storybook that is used by the first one. It added, of course, the Storybook dependencies and Babel and things like that. It created a couple of files automatically. So when you install it, it comes with example stories and example components that you could use or not to see how Storybook is working if it's the first time you work with it. So the next thing I did is to remove everything that was created by default, because for this project, I already knew how Storybook was working. I integrated it previously in other projects. So I deleted everything to start from scratch. Then, how to run Storybook. Normally, if it's a normal front-end project that's not JSS, you would do npm run Storybook to run the script that was added. If you are using a JSS project, it could be simpler. It could be JSS Storybook, because JSS is a shorthand for npm run. So I can show it to you if I open that rendering project. Open a terminal and do JSS Storybook. So we will see that first it compiles my current components and current stories, and it stores the output in some temporary folder outside of my repo. So that's one good thing. You can run NextDev at the same time as you run Storybook side by side, or you can run other things. And then it opens a browser window for my stories. So this is the stories I've defined for this project. I can show you a couple of stories for the style guide, the sample application that comes with JSS. I have the story for the checkbox, for the content list, for custom component, date, and rich text, for example, with the marquee that is working. The styles are working. I have the styles that are set on the sample application for JSS. And this is all steps I did to make them work that I will describe soon. So each story file is one of those package icons, and each variant is is the default here with the kind of flag icon. Back to here. So how a story is created in Storybook. Let me show again in the rendering here. I will just close that terminal by letting it run. And I'll show you where are my components. The components in my Next.js application are all in the components folder. For example, I have the fields and I have the rich text component. So a rich text component in the sample application needs two fields, two strings that are coming from a data source, sample and sample2. And it is a functional component in React. It uses the rich text component of JSS to display the sample field. And same thing for the sample2 field, but now it says this one is not editable and it has additional text classes and stuff. Then the story I created for this rich text component can be found in the source stories file. I organize the stories with the same subfolders as the components for me to be easier to manage. And all the stories, I've named them the same way their components are created, but they end with .stories.tsx instead of just .tsx. So the story for the rich text, for example, looks like this. So first, it imports React. It imports the necessary storybook things that it needs. It needs a component story and some component meta. Then we import whatever we want to test in that story or implement. So I want to, the story is for the rich text component of the style guide. So I import that component. Then a story in Storybook needs an export default. This export default needs a title, and the title will define where in the Storybook UI this component or this story will be visible. This one is in components, field, style guide, field usage, rich text. If I go back to here, we see it's under the component section, under the fields folder, and it's style guide, field usage, rich text, the name of my story. So this defines the structure in the UI. We need to tell which component will be tested in this story. So it's our style guide rich text component. And it is a component meta of the type of the component. Then a story in Storybook needs a template. This is what will be rendered. So what will be rendered will be a component story from Storybook of the type of the rich text component. Since the rich text component has properties, props here, And the type of props is a style guide field usage rich text props that receives two fields. We need those props passed in our template. So we need some args. I could have named this props, but by default, it's args for stories. And then I deconstruct those args to pass them one by one to the style guide rich text component. Then for a story, we need the variants. So those variants are exported as const, and the name of the const define the name of the variant inside Storybook. So see that all the variants are named default because default is the name of my exported const here. The variants are the template that is just here that is bound to some args. So for default variant, I have these args. I need some of them just for the component to be rendered correctly, and some others are for the content of the component. So params and renderings, I needed that for the complexity, the complex implementation of the style guide sample by the JSS team, but normally it wouldn't be needed. And then we have the fields. So my style guide component here, for its props, it has those fields, but it also has all the common style guide component props and all the style guide specimen fields. Specific specimen fields define that the fields also need a description and a heading. And the style guide component props define that I need a component factory, a rendering property, and params. So that's why here I had params and rendering. And here I have heading and description. Those are needed because of the composition of the prop objects I need to pass to my component. So I put some fake heading, fake description, and the sample field, I set a value of, this is a sample rich text field, and sample 2 has that marquee tag here. So that's why in here we see heading and description, and not for this one, but for my rich text, we see heading and description. Implementation and definition is something that is automatically generated by the top component of my rich text. So this rich text, yeah, it's based on a base component called the style guide specimen, if I'm correct. This is the one that exports implementation, definition, and so on. This is why we have implementation and definition here, and the real content of the component here. So this is how a variant is created. Then how to add a variant. So I could just take this block of code and duplicate it and call it variant. Let's do another variant. And here for the value, we could say, whoops, without typo, sub-Baltics. And whoops, just messed up a little bit this line. Like this. So I define another variant as a const, and then I put some args to it. Here I have some red squiggly because the value is too small to be on a separate line. And if I save that, automatically, then my another variant is displayed in Storybook. And Storybook is intelligent enough to add spaces between lowercase words and uppercase characters. So it displays a nice human readable version of the cons we exported. And we see 𝑺𝒊𝒕𝒃 rocks. So I could use variants to create data for edge cases. Let's say I don't know how my component reacts if there are more than one line of text in a paragraph. So how the CSS can be modified to have those edge cases, too long lines, too small lines, breaks in the content or whatever. I would create variants for that. Then, when you work in a JSS application, you would likely want that when somebody create a new component with JSS scaffold, you want that a story is added automatically, so the front-end developer don't have to duplicate an existing story, remove the component, change all the variables and the imports for the new component they create. It would be nice if we could automatically create the story for them when they create a component. It's quite easy to do. So here I added a storybook story to the JSS scaffold script. The JSS scaffold script is somewhere in the scripts folder, and there are scaffold components.ts. It comes out of the box with the JSS sample applications, and you can modify it the way you want to do different things when this command is called. There are some templates. So for example, there's the component source.ts. That's the template for the component itself. So it returns a string that will be the component content. So I used the same principle and the same methods, and I created a story source for the template I want for my stories. And my stories are like that. It returns this string. It's a little bit small. So it imports the same thing that we saw. So the import of the component itself, the title to put it in the right folder, the component, the template, and the default variant is there. So I modified also the scaffold component file. And after creating the component, I generate a story for that same component using the same variables that existed already. And this is the gist of the process is the scaffold file. You put the path where you want, you pass a function. This function comes from the storysrc.ts file and the file name you want for it, and then it creates the file for you. And in the output of the JSS scaffold command, I say, oh, if we outputted a story, then put a few more lines like, oh, you can test the component in Storybook by running this command, and you add your mock data or your fake data in the Storybook story directly. So that's how I managed to create those stories automatically, and I can show you how it works live. So now I have just this storybook that is running. So if I do scaffold, let's say 𝑺𝒊𝒕𝒃 will be my folder, and my component will be called new component. So that will create the 𝑺𝒊𝒕𝒃 subfolder. Oh, probably mobile. So it's broken. What if I do just new component then? It's been a while I've tested it. It seems to be broken now, but it used to work. This is how I created some of the stories. The demo god is not with me today. So that can be done. This is already committed in my repo. So if you look at it after the session, then you can see it. And then I went ahead and wanted to create stories for all the existing components I had. So I created an extra script in my package.json called generate stories, and it just run a different file. And I've taken the scaffold script, I modified it a bit to iterate over all the existing components and create a story for them if there was none already. This is also committed in the repo. So that's possible to do. When you work with Storybook, you need to pay attention to how you import the different components across files. So Storybook was starting to complain when I created all those stories for existing components because by default, the style guide sample was importing the components like the red lines here. So it was specifying from the root of the project, go in the components folder, then style guide, then import style guide specimen. But since Storybook doesn't execute at the root of the front-end project, but somewhere else, it didn't understand how to load that style guide specimen component from its own root. It stores the components elsewhere. So I had to change all the imports to be relative to the current file that is importing something. So in this case, I go back one folder and I import the style guide. I will cut the story short by showing chromatic. So here I'm currently on the main branch, but I created, let's do that. So here in the Storybook folder, there's a preview.js file where you can import some CSS or other things that you want the Storybook UI to see. That's how I made the CSS possible. So if I remove it and go back to Storybook, I lost all the CSS for this. So what I will do, I will create a branch called I will commit that change of CSS. Demo. And then in my repo, I will create a pull request for this change. So 𝑺𝒊𝒕𝒆𝒄 to main, create the pull request. Then I configured chromatic for this repo. So I needed to add an action workflow. I needed to create one setting for the project key. I needed to create the project in chromatic in the first place. And I've set some paid branch, what is it called? Branch protection rules. So I said, oh, UI review and UI test that are created by Chromatic needs to be run and needs to be green for the pull request to be able to merge. So now Chromatic is in progress. It is currently running all the tests. And I can show you an existing pull request maybe in time. So another demo I did for another user group. This one has Chromatic already ran and already accepted all the changes. That's Storybook UI review. This is the chromatic. So for build 8, for example, here where all the changes, so content list lost all of its styling and I accepted all the changes in a batch, and then it allowed me to complete the pull request. But this is the nice thing about Chromatic. You can see all the components, how they changed, and between the different versions and so on. So to close, there's a previous coworker of me, 𝙅𝙚𝙖𝙣-𝙂𝙂, who created another SOCCON presentation about Storybook, and his repo is also available online, so you can have different examples how to add fonts to Storybook UI and stuff like that. Sorry for taking too much time.
That's fine. Okay.
No worries. I mean, it's quite useful for all the JSS developers in this meeting, but yeah, that was really nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have questions, guys? Maybe quick ones? Okay, Peter again. Feel free.
Thank you.
Hi, Jeff.
Hello.
Thanks for the show. It's cool as usual. And I just want to ask, how do you can you generate TypeScript model automatically from the serialized items, or what is the approach to synchronize kind of a backend model and the front-end model? And is there like any automation how to keep it in sync automatically, which is the single source of truth? Is the serialized items or TypeScript? So what would you recommend? Or maybe you have something already working as a POC or whatsoever.
I've not come across this problem so far, so I don't have any mean for that. What we usually do is we work front end first, and then we go back end, as I explained. So the components that require data source first are created fields, for example, rich text. They are created here, the props. We define the fields we need, the type of fields, and then we go from there to Sitecore, create the correct templates manually. There's no automatic sync for us for that.
So if you have a change, you need to change the model in a TSX, basically, right? So, and also you need to change the template in Sitecore and just get it serialized to the YAML file.
Yeah. So sometimes this is done by one developer. So in my team, it's been special because we don't have front-end only developers at the moment. We were all full stack, Sitecore, and front-end developers at the same time. So we did all the steps ourselves, but we hired a couple of front-end only developers recently, and they will start this flow.
I see. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, anything else? Or any other question? Let's answer the question in the chat.
It says, regarding putting all together into Sitecore, are you using JSS import? If yes, how are you dealing with dynamic renderings, which is kind of the bad style? The answer is no, we're not using JSS import anymore. So as I mentioned in the description here, our workflow is that there's a Sitecore developer that creates the data source template items and renderings by hand by looking at the components on the front end and the props they need to have. So we are not using import anymore.
Okay, good. We already tried to complete your wishes for the next topics, and we will continue that in future. So that's also important. And yeah, wish you happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year. And we will see you in 2022. In a couple of months, we will have another meetup. So keep tuned.